Well, now on Book TV, we want to introduce you to Max Borders, who has written a new book called Superwealth. Mr. Borders, tell us about yourself before we get started.
Sure. I'm the editor of a magazine called The Freeman. It's one of the flagship publications of the Foundation for Economic Education, which is the nation's oldest libertarian think tank.
How'd you get started with that?
Well, I've been doing it for about a year now, editing at the Freeman, and I got mixed up with them by basically writing about these ideas in the movement. They saw someone they liked in me, and I've been doing it ever since, having a great time doing it.
Where'd you grow up?
Charlotte, North Carolina.
And where'd you go to school?
As an undergrad, I went to Appalachian State University in North Carolina and did my graduate work at University College London.
Why are you a libertarian?
I am a libertarian ultimately. I guess there are many facets to how one can answer that question. But for me, I see liberty as the goal. I think that people flourish as human beings when they are free, and I think we're more virtuous people when we're free. And I think cooperative arrangements based not on fear and hierarchy, but on cooperation and collaboration are much healthier relationships, and certainly I think history has borne that out.
Well, Max Borders, your book is called Superwealth, but the subtitle is Why We Should Stop Worrying About the Gap Between Rich and Poor. Why should we stop worrying?
Well, the whole book is devoted to answering the question you just posed, but let me take a couple of examples. First of all, the gap between rich and poor is not in and of itself a bad thing. And let me put it to you in the following sense. If I were to ask you, I play a little game with my son. My son's 6 years old, called Would You Rather? And it's usually like, would you rather have great big ears or a great big nose or something like that, and it's funny for him. But in this version of the game, I would want to ask any reader, would you rather there be a state of affairs where the poorest people in society are lifted up, and yet there be many, many more billionaires? Would you rather live in a state of affairs where we're all equal, but the poorest people in society are not as well off? And I think that is the dichotomy, that is the question we're confronted with when we think about wealth and want. We want the poorest people in society, so it is in and of itself, we ought not, I argue, be concerned about inequality per se. We should absolutely be concerned about the lot of the least advantaged.
And you play that game in your book, Superwealth. On the subject of the rich power gap, I suggest engaging people in a simple thought experiment.
That's right.
If you were king or queen for a day, and you could choose between only two states of affairs, which would they be? A, permanently institute a policy that significantly reduces the gap between rich and poor, and B, permanently institute a policy that makes everyone better off, including the poor. Try it out, you write, take your time. Before jumping to any conclusions, think about these choices carefully. It's not a logic test. As I said, the thought experiment is designed to unpack our intuitions on the subject of rich and poor. What are our intuitions?
I think we have a lot of intuitions about rich and poor that come from our clannish caveman instincts. We tend to see someone with more and maybe we want it, or we see someone with less and we feel indignation. I think those instincts have to be overcome with the idea that, look, this is a virtuous system. If we were to go walk into a rainforest and think about how resources are distributed in a rainforest, we would look around at the canopy, at the great mahogany trees there, and say, wow, they gobble up all the resources. And yet, that, in many people's mind, is rather a virtuous ecosystem. A rainforest is not a place of equal distribution of resources. The termites on the ground, or the tapirs in the trees have a different share of those resources than the great mahogany trees in the canopy. So it's really about the whole flourishing of the ecosystem. And ecosystems are not equal. Economic ecosystems are also not equal. And people create and contribute varying degrees of value and receive remuneration for varying degrees of contribution to that value ecosystem. That is as natural as the rainforest, in my view.
Who are the makers and the takers that you talk about in Superwealth?
That's a great question. Interestingly, started out asking me why I'm a libertarian. Another reason I'm a libertarian is because I'm bound and determined to make a distinction between makers and takers. Because the makers in the world are the ones who do create value, and the takers in the world are those who don't create value, but call themselves business people or entrepreneurs, and essentially use the levers of power to divert resources to their own coffers. I think this is a terribly devastating state of affairs in our country. In fact, we're at a conference right now that is devoted to the theme, Are We Rome? We know that the Romans basically taxed the people and gave them bread and circuses. We know that there were favored cronies in the state in ancient Rome, and I want to see, as a libertarian, as someone who I believe understands value ecosystems that are economies, that we disentangle those who are diverting resources and creating upward transfers from poor people to rich people, like rich stadium owners, say, who owners of sports teams. This is, to me, unconscionable. This is not entrepreneurship. It's basically gaming the system and getting money in your coffers. I find that morally objectionable and socially destructive. However, there are people in the world who are creating tremendous value for people. Good things, goods and services, whether it be life-saving drugs or fresh, healthy foods at Whole Foods, say. These entrepreneurs, the people who start these companies, are participating in the value ecosystem, and they're the makers.
Max Borders and Superwealth, you say that Walmart has probably done more to reduce poverty than any organization in the world.
I believe that, yes.
How so?
If you consider let's take a lot of facets of this remarkable juggernaut of a business over the last 40 years or so. They have a tremendous reach, not only across the United States, but they offer goods and services at very low prices to people who we might call the least well-off in society. Now, I admit I'm a Walmart and Target shopper myself, but if you consider the extent of these organizations and the prices they're able to make goods and services available to people, that first right there, they're saving money relative to other companies. They're saving poor people money. Second, consider the people who participate as workers in this system, to whom Walmart outsources. There are probably millions of Chinese people on the order of over the last few years alone, millions of Chinese people in one country alone who have been lifted out of poverty merely by virtue of the existence of Walmart alone, because they outsource some of their, get some of their products manufactured in China, to which our citizens benefit. They are incredible job creators. There's a debate going on right now about whether the wages they offer are good enough by some arbitrary standard set by a politician or an activist. And yet, we know people have these jobs, and this is preferable to nothing, for example, or to being perpetually on the dole. Of course, if you're a politician, being perpetually on the dole is something you might like. But Walmart, despite some of their objections on net, has created tremendous benefit for the least advantaged in society, and I think that's undeniable.
And you write, by historical and international standards, the American poor are in fine shape.
Absolutely. I think one need only go, there's a measure, this is a fancy term called the Gini Index. The Gini Index measures the gap between rich and poor, okay? We can go to countries like the United States, like Hong Kong, or like Singapore, and we will find that the Gini indices in these countries are very great. That is, the distance between the richest person there and the rest of us is very great. But would we rather be in these places than we would places with reduced Gini indices, such as Venezuela, or North Korea, or Myanmar? I would submit to you, we would not. I'd much rather live in Singapore, in Hong Kong, or the United States while there is great inequality, because the ecosystem of value, as I put it earlier,